Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, this is a video I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and I thought now was an appropriate time. We're heading towards the end of spring, and I always felt like spring was a great time to dig out retro consoles. I don't know why, but, and also it's just, good distraction from all the crazy shit going on out there. We got something going on here in the States. I guess it happens every 4 years or so. I don't know. I never really paid any attention to that shit. But anyway, I thought, let's go back in time to what was quite possibly the greatest rivalry in gaming history. Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis. Now, I've said countless times on this channel, the Super Nintendo is my favorite console of all time. But I like the Genesis too, or I should actually, like is a simple word. I should say I love the Genesis. But, each one had some qualities that made them pretty unique. For example, like the Genesis had a more powerful processor, allowing games to scroll faster, while the Super Nintendo had better sound effects. For example, like when you had the occasional voices and jazz like that. I don't know, it's like when you had the occasional voices on the consoles, like with the Super Nintendo it sounded somewhat real, like a person or something. With the Genesis it kind of sounded like it was recorded through a pillow. And we should probably talk about the look of the console, I guess, which, to be honest, I don't really give a damn what a console looks like, so long as it runs well and plays great games, which, as you can see, I have the Model 2 Genesis. One thing I want to touch on about that is that the Super Nintendo, because some of them turn yellow over time, it tends to happen with launch systems, and the reason for that is because the launch Super Nintendos had, like, this heat-resistant plastic in it that I guess when it's exposed to, like, sunlight or something, it makes it turn yellow. Something like that. As for the Genesis, I'm probably in the minority here, but when the Genesis has the add-ons, like the Sega CD and the 32X, I think it looks kind of cool with them. I don't know why. Like, if you just look at it, like, from this angle or like that, you ignore all the cords and wires and stuff on the back, and you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know, I just think it looks kind of cool, like, with the two things on there. Like, maybe it's just because I like weird things. And of course, that was part of what, those add-ons were part of what led to Sega's eventual downfall. But that was the thing with Sega. I feel like they were kind of more willing to take risks, which, again, kind of was one of the things that led to their downfall. But it was interesting, like, that was one of the things, like, the add-ons, for example. They also, had a bunch of celebrities promoting the console, which was brilliant, but I'm sure it wasn't exactly cheap either. Then, of course, there was the good old-fashioned censorship things. Nintendo had a nasty habit of censoring games on the Super Nintendo, such as Wolfenstein and the first Mortal Kombat, whereas Genesis didn't do that. Another thing was that, when it comes to RPGs, like, this was the 90s, RPGs weren't too big here in the States, and, which is part of the reason we never saw a lot of the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games over here. And so, well, there was also strategy games, or tactical RPGs, as some people like to call them. Nintendo had Fire Emblem, while Sega had Shining Force. And, the Fire Emblem games that were for the Super Famicom were never ported over to the Super Nintendo, but, the two Shining Force games that were for the Mega Drive came over to the Genesis. And, I wasn't there for the board meetings or anything, but this is just kind of an assumption of mine. I was like, my guess is that it was like, Nintendo was like, Fire Emblem would be too complicated for Western audiences, so we're not gonna bring those over there. Whereas Sega was like, well, let's give the consumer, let's let them be the judge. Let's give them a chance, so we'll bring the Shining Force games over there to the Genesis. Like, again, that's just kind of a theory of mine. Like, see what I'm saying? Like, how I feel like Sega was more willing to take risks. Another good example was how they Oh, what the hell was his name? The president of Sega of America at the time. When Sonic the Hedgehog came out, and it became, he came up with the idea, lower the price of the Genesis and bundle it with Sonic the Hedgehog. And it worked, it moved a lot of consoles. Sonic was a huge hit. And, yeah. And then, when it comes to graphics, even as a kid, I always thought the graphics on the Super Nintendo looked better. On the Genesis, they look okay, but maybe this is just me, again, but I always thought they looked kind of fuzzy, like, if that makes sense. Of course, better graphics don't make a better game, necessarily. And speaking of games, that's probably the highlight of this that we should get into. We'll go by the genres. We'll start with the most popular one, platformers. Both of them had the same games, like, on both systems. Like, for example, Bubsy and Cool Spot, whether you like those games or not. I don't know, I always kind of like those games, but the point is they were on both consoles. And I'm pretty sure Aero the Acrobat was on both of them. That's a good platformer, which, again, I don't know. But anyway, of course they had their exclusive ones as well, like Super Nintendo had Super Mario World, the Donkey Kong Country games, the Mega Man X games, so on and so forth. Genesis had the Sonic games, Vector Man, what the hell is that game? Chameleon Kid. And then, of course, another forgotten platformer from this era was Sparkster, who was this opossum character with medieval knight armor, a sword, and a jetpack. Kind of a weird combination, but anyway, it was by Konami, which, as we remember, they did kind of two different games for two different consoles. So, like, there was Sparkster for the Super Nintendo and Rocket Knight Adventures for the Genesis. Both different games, but kind of the same concept, the same type of platformer. Both were awesome platformers, very underrated. And, Super Nintendo had Contra 3, the Alien Wars, and Sega had, or Genesis, I should say, had the Contra Hardcore. Again, both great Contra games, but, Contra Hardcore is brutally difficult, but it's cool that you can pick all the different characters. Contra 3 is a bit easier, but maybe it's just because I played it so many damn times. It's actually my favorite Contra game of all time. And I always liked the overhead levels in that, because I feel like it kind of added a bit more variety to it. Cat's walking over to the closet. Of course, there was Castlevania, or Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo, which is an epic game. Castlevania Bloodlines for the Genesis. I'll be honest with you, I've never played it. Super Nintendo had Turtles in Time. Genesis had Hyperstone Heist. Both great games, but I feel like the Hyperstone Heist is a little more complicated. It's like the levels feel a little bit longer, or something. I don't know. But let's talk about some of the other genres, like racing games. Both of which had your traditional type racing games. Like racing cars and stuff, and then they also had their own unique ones, like Super Nintendo had F-Zero and Mario Kart, while Genesis had the Road Rash games. Sports games, not really my thing. Obviously, Genesis had way more sports games. And when it comes to playing sports, like actually playing them, like going outside and playing sports, the ones that I always liked were hockey, basketball, and occasionally baseball. And I like playing those with, like, on these sometimes as well. Obviously there's probably more of them on the Genesis. There's some good ones on the Super Nintendo, for example. Like, you got NBA Jam, for example, which is on both systems. Then there's fighting games, which were huge in the 90s, especially during this era. Both consoles had the Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter games. And they also, then you had their exclusives as well and stuff. Like, for example, Super Nintendo had Killer Instinct. Genesis had Eternal Champions, which I think is highly underrated. Then, of course, they had their bad ones as well. Like, both consoles had Shaq Fu and Rise of the Robots, which... Rise of the Robots is bad. That game is a mess, but I always loved the music in that game. I don't know, I just think it's kind of catchy. And, of course, Super Nintendo had some other shitty fighting games as well, like Doomsday Warrior and Street Combat, which my brother had those when we were kids. And I played them again in recent years. Doomsday Warrior, that game sucks, but it has some pretty cool characters though. Like, you know, there's like a lizard man, a gelatinous blob lady, and there's some guy who looks like he's from the Mad Max movies. But Street Combat, oh god, that is actually a reskin of a fighting game called Ranma and a Half. You know, it was for the Super Famicom. It was an anime of the same name that's like, apparently it was made into a Super Famicom game, and then it was reskinned on the Super Nintendo as Street Combat. And again, played that as a kid, played it in recent years, and honestly, I can say that is the worst video game I've ever played. It makes Shaq Fu look like a masterpiece. We'll just leave it at that. But as for other genres, like puzzle games, you know, there's some good ones on there. Like Genesis had Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, which is actually a reskin of Puyo Puyo. It's an okay game, but Genesis also had, what the hell do you call it, Columns, which that's a good game. Super Nintendo had Tetris Attack, which is actually a reskin of a Super Famicom game called Panel de Pon or something like that. Yeah, Tetris Attack. God, the hours that my neighbor and I dumped into that as a kid. And of course, my favorite genre were beat-em-ups. You know, both consoles had, what the hell do you call it, Battletoads Double Dragon, the Ultimate Team. Genesis had the Streets of Rage games. I'm mixing up that, but as well as Golden Axe, which I love medieval stuff. So having you know, like a medieval beat 'em up, it's just like, oh. Probably the best Golden Axe game was Revenge of Death Adder, which was exclusive to arcade. It's never been made on any home consoles or anything. I mean, unless Sega wants to make a arcade collection like they do with their Genesis collection type things. But anyway, you know, and then of course Streets of Rage, which, you know, obviously the best ones are 2 and 3. Although the first one, it's very different from the 2 and 3. It's kind of, it's like a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Like not jittery, but it's like, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's like a little wonky, kind of like, it's hard to sluggish, that's the word I was looking for. It's very, like, sluggish. But I definitely have a special heart for place in my heart for the first Streets of Rage. And I always kind of like the idea how in that one, instead of having special moves, you have, like, you're pulling, like, a move that will basically clear all enemies on the stream, you know, like a cop car comes in and fires a bazooka or the chain gun or something. Then Super Nintendo had Battletoads and Battlemaniacs, the Final Fight games, Peacekeepers, Batman Forever, list goes on, but yeah, I love beat-em-ups from that era, especially from that era. And then, of course, both consoles had amazing soundtracks, although I kind of like Super Nintendo's music a little bit more than the Genesis. Like, both of them had, you know, were good, like, had great soundtracks. Like, a lot of people talk about Earthworm Jim is a good example, which is another platformer that was on both consoles. And most people say that the Genesis version has better music. I honestly can't really pick between the two of them. I think Earthworm Jim's soundtrack, I think, sounds good on both consoles. But another thing is, I feel like Jim is better, at least for me, I think he's controls better on the Super Nintendo. However, the Genesis version has an entirely additional level that's missing from the Super Nintendo version. And since we're on the subject of platformers, again, I'll end it with this. Like, Mario versus Sonic. Who's better? Well, you know, I mean, that's where their rivalry started, was during this. And whether it be the old games or the newer ones, I always found Mario games more fun to play, but I like Sonic's universe better. Especially, like, the old school one when he was, like, you know, before, like, the, came into, like, the human world and stuff. I'm not saying those games are bad or anything. They're still very good, but I don't know. But, yeah, so that's just how I felt about this classic rivalry. So, what are you guys' thoughts on the Super Nintendo and Genesis? Like, did you like one better, or do you have, like, different opinions about it? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and as always, thanks for watching.